Yeah, yeah.
I'm just going live to YouTube now. Mayor Andrew is joining us. Should be ready to go in a minute here.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm late. Hello, everyone. How are we doing, Hope?
We are good. Yep, we're ready. We're ready to go. Whatever you are.
Okay, now listen. I'm working on the revised agenda, right?
That's correct.
Which includes the closed meeting.
That is correct.
Okay, that's fine. I just okay. So if everybody's ready to go here, welcome everybody. Thank you for setting aside this afternoon to learn all about our finances from Raj. This is going to be the Committee of the Whole meeting of Monday, December 2nd, 2020. And I'm going to open the meeting and the approval of the agenda. Late items, Hope, anything?
The only late items will be the Chief Financial Officer's PowerPoint presentations, but other than that, there is nothing.
Okay, fantastic. And approval of the agenda. Anybody have anything else that they want to slip in here? It's pretty brief. Okay, I'll move the approval.
Second.
Thank you, Michael. And all in favor? Aye.
Yeah.
Okay, public comments. Do we have anybody online there, Hope?
I've not received any requests for the speakers list. The only member of the public here is Bronwyn.
Okay, lovely.
So there are none.
Hello, Bronwyn.
Oh, we just have one member of the public joining now, so maybe just hang tight.
Okay, yeah.
A moment. Maybe just call for public comments one more time.
Yeah, now we're done with the section of public comments. Does anybody out there online have a will to speak? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? Okay, we're going to move on then. And we're going to number 3, which is staff reports. Statutory reserves. Raj Hayre, Chief Financial Officer. And over to you, Raj.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just going to share my screen here, Hope. Hopefully I do that right. Are you guys seeing my PowerPoint slide right now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, okay, hold on just a sec. How about now?
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I've got 2 PowerPoint presentations. The first one is going to be on a discussion of reserves. Focused on the capital renewal and replacement reserve. I'm going to talk a little bit about how reserves work and the purpose of reserves. And I'm going to get into a few specifics of the renewal and replacement reserve, which led up to the recommendations by the Finance Advisory Committee. 2 of the 4 recommendations at the last meeting pertained to a presentation and report that I provided the Finance Advisory Committee with on statutory reserves. So before getting into the specifics of the reserves, I'm just going to talk a little bit about reserves. So essentially municipalities provide services, facilities, and other things that are necessary and desirable for all or part of the community. And to provide these services, municipalities are responsible for purchasing, constructing, operating, and maintaining infrastructure, which is kind of what I've got highlighted in the middle of that hierarchy triangle. And so infrastructure responsibilities vary from the replacement of culverts, bridges. Hopefully we don't ever have a bridge in the same condition as I put in the slide here, but roads, trails, pathways, recreation facilities, and water and wastewater systems. And generally speaking, there are 3 options to pay for the infrastructure and service delivery options. So you can either use debt, spend revenue as it's collected, or set aside a portion of revenue to save for large projects. And that's where reserves come in. So your operating budget would contain a ongoing provision for a contribution to reserves, and then you would use reserves to fund capital needs as they arise. So in terms of the way reserves work at Bowen Island Municipality, the operating budget contains a provision for an annual contribution to reserves. So in 2020, this amount was just shy of $1.5 million. And so that essentially, the amount of the contribution is built up gradually over years Council had embedded a 1.5% annual property tax increase to be contributed to the capital renewal and replacement reserve commencing in 2009. So that's been in place for approximately 11 years. The appropriate amount of the annual contribution will be better understood as we move deeper into the asset management exercise and better understand the condition of our assets. Based on the best information that we have today, the renewal and replacement required works over the next several years and reserve balances are not adequate to meet the essentially the annual works required. So as a result, much of the renewal and replacement is being deferred and put off, and that just compounds the problem.
Raj, I just want to interrupt. Could you move it to presentation mode? It's small screen right now. If you,
I am in presentation mode right now. Actually.
Your notes are showing, Raj, which is what's
Oh.
shrinking the screen, I think.
Oh, that's weird that there, because hold on just a sec. Displays, my notes are showing at the bottom as well.
on the right.
On the right-hand side.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can get rid of those.
Should be able to.
There, yeah, there you go, Raj.
How's that? Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So in terms of a look at our infrastructure needs, I've done a 5-year analysis here of basically our needs of the infrastructure reserve. So I'm starting off with our opening balance of about $3.3 million in 2021. And the 2021 anticipated tax levy contribution from reserves will be $1,457,000 plus 112. So it'll be just over $1.5 million if we approve a 2% of the previous year tax levy increase. So we'll be collecting just over $1.5 million. We'll allocate 10,000 of that to the public art reserve, which is within the public art policy. And we'll hold aside $200,000 to put in other reserves, we plan to put aside $200,000 into reserves, which would allow us to invest in new assets, which would leave a net contribution of $1,359,600 to the asset management reserve. Now, as we went through our capital budgeting exercise, requests and needs for capital replacement in 2021 identified totaled $4.8 million. So if we were to grant all of those reserves, we wouldn't be able to grant all of those reserves because that would put us in a deficit position. And the exercise goes on in subsequent years. So what this slide is actually demonstrating is that we do not have adequate balances in our reserve for renewal and replacement to take care of all of the capital replacement and renewal needs. So how do we address that? Well, we address that by deferring projects, seeking out other means of funding such as grant funding and borrowing. And in terms of going through and prioritizing, this slide here demonstrates a capital renewal and replacement program, which is the second line from the bottom, that is sustainable within the balance of the capital renewal and replacement reserve. So if we went back to the previous slide, you can see that $4.7 million is in funding is required if we were going to take care of everything that's required to be taken care of. However, by either borrowing or by taking advantage of grant opportunities and deferring projects, we will propose a budget of $2,322,000, which will leave about $2.3 million in our reserves to address any emergencies that may come up during the course of the year. Now you can see by deferring and doing that, as we go down, our balance will drop from 2.3 to 1.3 million in 2022, and then it'll stay stable, and then it will slowly increase. However, we are deferring works in those outer years, but it does give us, as the balance starts to grow, it gives us the ability to address more of those deferred capital works in later years. which is essentially, that is a summary. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on the reserve section. I wanted to actually leave time for talking about the 2021 budget process. But essentially, that presentation on reserves led to the Finance Advisory Committee's recommendations, which you'll see in a couple of, in a page up, but they had a few whereases in their recommendations. So they had basically stipulated, whereas the Finance Committee has received all of the program requests submitted for the 2021 budget process to date, which would require a property tax increase. That part of the recommendation we're going to have in the second PowerPoint. We haven't gotten to the 2021 budget. So what they had received was this second whereas, where they received details for all of the project requests. They had received an estimate at October 28th because I didn't have all the requests in, and they'd received an analysis of the reserves balance. And then the Finance Advisory Committee had made reference to a number of guiding principles that guide budget decision-making in the whereases of their recommendations. And what the Finance Advisory Committee recommended with respect to the reserves balances presentation they were given was that council direct staff to prioritize and defer capital asset renewal and replacement requests, ensuring year-end closing balance of the capital renewal and replacement reserves exceed the following for the next 5 years. So they're saying 500, 650, 800, 900 for 2024 and 1,100,000 for 2025. So the proposed financial plan for 2021, if we go back to this slide, you can see that the ending closing balance proposed or resulting as a result of the proposed capital budget exceeds all of those minimum balances. And the second recommendation that came out of the review of reserves was that council direct staff to develop a series of options for an additional, sorry, I've got that. Again, this recommendation here for additional 1.5 consideration to determine whether an extraordinary increase provides sufficient additional benefits for taxpayer support. My apologies for including this recommendation here. This recommendation falls out of a review of the 2021 operating budget, which you'll receive a little bit later on. So really, this first recommendation here, sorry, I didn't mean to slip back and forth. This first recommendation here pertains to the report that I just provided. And there were two other recommendations which essentially stemmed. So this report right here, this recommendation at the top is also out of the operating budget, and I've repeated one of my recommendations. My apologies. One of the recommendations of the Finance Advisory Committee was to ensure that we didn't spend more than, I believe, $275,000 a year on investment and new assets. And the capital plan does take care of that. I've just misstated them on my PowerPoint presentation. So what I will do at this point is open up the discussion for questions on the capital reserves and discussion of the Finance Advisory's recommendations, and I'll put the other recommendation up in a minute.
All right, has anybody got anything? Thank you, Raj. Any questions for Raj?
Gary?
Yes.
Gary, I think it's not a bad thing to state when we look at 1.5% or any other percents. I think when I last spoke to Raj, that in terms of dollars, 1% comes to, and Raj, if I've got this wrong, I think it was somewhere in the region of under 60,000, 50-something thousand dollars. So when we look at this number, let's take 1.5. We're not talking about mega bucks here. We're talking about 1 point equaling under $60,000. Now, Raj, have I got that right?
What I was going to ask, Michael, was that 1.5% increase recommendation. Can we hold off on discussing that until after I talk about the 2021 financial plan, because I will address the exact point that you raised in that part of the presentation. I've put this recommendation here by accident on this slide here. The recommendation that we should be looking at here is that we don't spend more than $275,000 a year in investment in new assets. And we will not be proposing a budget. We will be proposing a budget in accordance with that recommendation. And we do support that recommendation.
You okay with that, Michael?
Totally, Gary, and let's deal with that one later on. I think that the question that Raj has just posed us is the most one. And when we say funded, do we mean funded from reserves, or also are we including funding from grants and borrowing?
So in terms of this particular exercise, where this first recommendation is referring to, is your question with respect to the $200,000?
Yes.
Even though the recommendation didn't stipulate specifically, the reference for the $200,000 was from internal reserves, not from external borrowing.
Okay.
Okay, I've got a question, Gary, please.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Can we go back to the slide, one that showed the reserves and how we would, the amount that we would use each year to make it reasonable? This one. Yeah.
This one right here.
Yeah. So how did, so instead of doing all of the capital investment that we needed, we dropped that way down by, more than 50%. So where did that number come from? And you could have come up with all kinds of different numbers that would make this roughly work. Can you just explain this a little bit more, please?
Certainly. So some of the big asks where we were needing to do about $700,000 or $800,000 in works on culverts. So we're proposing that we'll do half that work in 2021. We have a fire truck for $640,000 that was requested from reserves. I'm proposing that we fund that over 5 years through equipment financing. So I've got that, and that way we can fund it through the reserve over 5 years rather than all in 2021. Right now you can borrow money from the Municipal Finance Authority at less than 1.5%. The rate is 1.21%. So it just makes economic sense to risk manage by keeping the money in reserves and borrowing and funding over 5 years. The road program initially, the roads renewal and replacement program had a request of about $700,000, and that's what was recommended as the annual spend. We've proposed to do $400,000 worth of work. And there are a couple of other large projects that were deferred as well, but those are the large. So basically we've deferred those works until later on, until we can actually build up the reserve balances to sustain that level of.
Okay, great. Thanks, Raj. Now so we'll be getting into some of those details then when you come through with the 5-year budget, explain how we're deferring some things and so on.
Yeah. As we go through so as we go through the public consultation and present more details on the budget, we'll have the information in terms of the items that are included in the budget. I'm not sure whether that part of the discussion will include a detailed discussion on what's been deferred.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Just a question, Raj.
Maureen, go ahead.
Yeah.
So if I can understand sort of the process that has been followed to date, there was consultation with all of the departments, a review of the pending capital projects, a calculation that was looking at if we did all of this quickly, it would result in a horrifying 15% tax increase. And then we pulled back and looked at these again with the intent to bring it into some realm of palatability. to council and the community. Is that about right?
I should have actually gone over the process at the beginning. My apologies. So this particular part of the discussion does not have a relationship to the 15%.
Right.
That's the operating budget that we'll get into. So the overall budgeting process was comprised of actually, so if we're talking about the budgeting process for capital, which impacts reserves, essentially all of the managers identified what the required capital works for the upcoming 5 years were. So we put all of those works together and we saw, and reserves are used to fund those. So we have a balance in reserves and we contribute a fixed amount to those reserves each year. As I demonstrated over here, like in 2021, we'll be putting 1,457,000 plus an additional 2% if that is approved of the tax levy. So we'll be putting 1.5 million, and that does show up as a line in the operating budget every year and has for the past 10, 15 years. So that is the amount of funding that goes into reserves, and then that reserve balance is used to fund the capital works that are proposed. So getting back to the process that we're talking about here, staff proposed that these were the works in orange that needed to be done over the next 5 years. However, we don't have balances in reserves to do those. So we went through a prioritization exercise of deferring works based on risks to the municipality and risks of not doing that work being taken into consideration. And then I also looked at other funding alternatives. So for example, I talked about the fire truck there, we could be able to borrow, and we were able to get that number down to the numbers that are reported here for each year, so that we're able to fund projects within the limits of, or the constraints of funding in the capital renewal and replacement reserve.
Okay, so, and forgive me if I'm being stupid here. So is there elsewhere in the presentation a summary of what is being funded for each of those 5 years?
I've got in the next presentation, I've talked about the big pieces. You do have a list that I had essentially sent out, the long list of all the projects that are proposed.
Yeah.
But I don't believe I had narrowed it down to what will be included. We will be including that in the consultation piece that goes out to the public in terms of a listing of all of the assets. So in this particular presentation later on, I'll have a slide that makes reference to the significant projects that are included.
Okay, that would be helpful.
Okay.
And just a final point, this doesn't reflect any of the pending grant applications. The 4 million or so for sewer, the 800,000 for the composting facility, and so forth.
The composting facility, as an example, is not funded from the reserves. So this does not, I don't believe it reflects the composting facility in the numbers here.
Does it reflect the sewer?
But, pardon?
Does it reflect the sewer?
Yeah.
So it does? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Raj.
Okay, anybody else?
Harriet,
Allison, you're in?
Raj, can you put that multicolored slide back up?
This one?
Yeah. How do you get a $7 million balance? Oh, it's funding deficit. Okay. I
It's a
didn't
funding
get
deficit.
to read the whole thing. You scrolled through too fast.
Is
Okay.
that it, Allison?
Yeah, I just wanted to have another look at that. Maybe I'll just take a screenshot so I can actually refer back to it if I want.
Okay, anybody else have any queries from Raj?
Gary, really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead,
Gary?
Rob.
Yeah. So Raj, just I think Maureen's questions answered some of mine, but I'm just wondering on particulars, like, are we going to do another HR position or an FTE here or there? Are we going to have, is that a discussion we're having today, or is that something that you're basically, staff's going to come up with a full-on recommendation and you say yay or nay to that? How is that going to work?
So we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in the subsequent presentation. We won't be getting into the specifics of discussions of what we should be include or I mean, what we should include or what we won't include. But if we can just save that for the subsequent discussion, I think you'll get a lot more clarity on that, Rob.
Okay, thanks.
That's not what we're talking about here. All we're talking about here is to provide council with an understanding of the pressures on the capital renewal and replacement reserve in terms of whether they can support the Finance Advisory Committee's recommendation to increase the tax levy by 2% of the previous year's tax levy for dedication for an increase to the contribution to the capital asset and renewal reserve.
Okay, thanks.
Gary, I've just got one more.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, and so thank you for this, Raj, and I really appreciate it. I certainly support the additional 112,000 to make it the 2%. But what confused me is the last thing that you said, or the second to last thing, about why is the compost facility not funded in the same way? It's a capital project, no, that we would own.
It will be funded in the capital projects, but it's not posing a pressure on the capital renewal and replacement reserve because it's being funded entirely by grant funding and long-term borrowing. So,
Okay.
So it's not being funded out of the reserve.
Got it. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
It's Allison again.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm just a little concerned that Raj's answer to that is now going to let people think the capital replacement and renewal reserve, David, is only for replacing existing assets. So the compost facility is a new thing. So it would never be funded out of there.
No.
Thanks for adding to that, Allison. I appreciate your.
Right. Okay. Got it.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you very much, Allison. Yeah.
Okay. Rob, do you have your hand up still or again?
No, that was from prior. I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I don't see anybody else's hand up here. I don't see anybody in the program. So I think with that, we're going to move on to 3.2, which is back to you again, of course, Raj. This is a financial plan, 2021 to 2025. Please
So
go
if you
ahead.
guys give me a couple of minutes to load my slides, I think Liam is going to provide you with an overview to start with on this, and then I'll
Okay.
jump in after he provides the overview on that. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. And thanks, everybody, for being here today. As you know, the goal of the Committee of the Whole is to provide Council with a full view of issues so that Council can move forward with recommendations to Council and make better decisions at regular Council meetings. And so this meeting today is focused on the financial budget for period of 2021 out to 2025. And we've taken I wanted to just provide a couple of context statements before we get into this discussion, because this is much more the meat of the tax implications, because this is where we're going to be talking about the operating budget. And so we did just talk about more so the capital budget, which is funded primarily from reserves, as Raj mentioned. So we've taken a bit of a different approach in developing the budget this year than in the past. We've had a more direct one-on-one engagement with each of the department leads. And we've had the opportunity to review and prioritize each department's individual needs. And through these discussions, we as a management team we've also been able to identify areas that are in need of attention, in particular regarding how we collect funds for those services that we're providing, and with special attention to our fees and charges. And I don't want to get into too many details on that today. it's a topic that for discussion for another day. But it is a bit relevant because if we can focus some time and energy to review all of our fees and charges and make sure that we've got the right fee that's being targeted to the right source and for the right entity or person or organization to be paying that fee, ultimately then we can make sure that the tax implications on a year-to-year basis are more appropriate. Really what I've noticed in my time here is that, Bowen's come a long way in its 20 years of existence, but there's lots of room for growth and opportunity, especially when it comes to fees and charges. And so we should find some time to sit down as a staff team and then collectively as council in the future to discuss how we're going to move forward with those, which ultimately should have a positive impact on the general tax roll. So I don't want to get into too much detail on that today. What we're providing with council here today is a list of the highest priority items identified by each department. All of the items identified are a need. We've been very careful to make sure that we're not bringing forward items that aren't deemed necessary. And the needs are long, and there are many, but it's not to say that everything has to be done in 2021. And so there are opportunities to defer some of those needs into out years. And so to help sharpen council's focus on these budget pressures, we have developed a suite of 4 scenarios, which further prioritizes the departmental needs. And as Raj will describe, we spend a lot of time going back and forth with the management team on those needs. And we did reconfirm with everybody about what these scenarios look like. And before I hand it over to Raj, I also do want to take a moment to just thank him in particular, as well as the management team for all of their hard work in developing the budget priorities and putting together the information for you today. I've worked closely with Raj on this entire process, and I can say with confidence that what Raj has put together today is a comprehensive and a very reasonable approach to tackling the many budgetary pressures that the municipality is facing. And I also want to acknowledge that we recognize that this past year has been an incredibly difficult year for many Bowen Island residents, if not all, as well as Bowen businesses. And the first wave of the pandemic was not an easy wave to get through for many folks or many businesses. And I particularly feel that this second wave may prove to be irrecoverable for some. And so we've taken these challenging situations into mind as we develop this budget. And, we're working hard to make sure that the budget information being presented today is considerate of these pressures that the whole community is facing. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Raj to walk us through what we've been able to put together today for your review and discussion. And again, just as a friendly reminder that this is a good opportunity for you to ask questions and get clarity on the process and how we may move forward with our engagement with the public. But we're not making decisions here today.
Thank you very much, Liam. Well said. And back over to you then, Raj.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks, Gary. So I'm just gonna, I better share my screen, otherwise you won't know what I'm talking about here. Okay, does everybody see my cover page here?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna start the presentation off with a little budgeting 101, which may be repeat for all of you, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. There seemed to be some confusion in the earlier part about the 15.5% and capital and stuff. So a little budgeting 101 here. So our financial plan actually has 4 components to it. We've got the general fund operating budget, which is also known as a program budget. And that is where we were talking about the 15.5%. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a subsequent slide. Then we have the capital plan, which we're also going to talk about in this presentation. And then there is the budget for the water systems and the sewer system. Each of them has an operating budget and a capital budget. And we're not going to be talking about those today, but we are currently meeting with each local advisory committee and reviewing budgets with them prior to going to public consultation. So in terms of the operating program budget, essentially the funding for the operating budget comes in through property taxes, user fees, grants, and donations. And the expenditures in the operating budget are represented by ongoing day-to-day expenses. So things like wages and salaries, insurance, contracts for services and professional services such as audit fees and legal fees, IT support costs, your materials and supplies, debt servicing, grants to community organizations. And then we also have a provision for transfer to reserves, which is what we were talking about earlier. And that goes in as a funding source for the capital budget. So we take the transfers to reserve numbers and we basically deposit them to a sort of bank account, which is our reserve, and that's used for funding your capital project. So in terms of your capital budget, you have money coming in from reserve, contributions that are made from the operating budget. You'd have funding coming in from either debt or borrowing and from grant funding. And that money is expended on replacement and renewal and investment in new equipment, roads, vehicles. Well, roads, actually new investment would typically come from developers. So we're spending on renewal and replacement of vehicles, structures such as the docks out there, the multitude of sheds and equipment, like our equipment's yard, for example, has infrastructure there. Linear infrastructure that is encompassing like our culverts and whatnot. And then the linear underground infrastructure for water and sewer would be funded through the water and sewer reserves, and a number of other assets that are used in providing services to the community. So in terms of operating budget pressures for this year, I'm going to now turn my attention, after having talked a little bit about the budget, to the operating budget pressures that we're facing this year. And so first of all, I lost my place in my notes here. First of all, we have a pressure of a 2% tax levy increase to our contribution to capital renewal and replacement reserves. So as illustrated in the information that was provided earlier on reserves, the reserve balance in asset reserves for renewal and replacement of assets is not sufficient to address the ongoing renewal and replacement needs of the aging infrastructure that we have. So after reviewing the 5-year projection of renewal and replacement needs and the asset reserve balances available to fund them, the FAC recommended that the contribution to the renewal and replacement of reserves be increased by 2% of the previous year tax levy for each of the next 5 years. So this would amount to the $112,400 tax pressure we're seeing in 2021. In addition, we have salaries and benefits cost of living adjustment, which the staff compensation policy calls for being implemented as of January 1st of each year. You'll note that there was no COLA applied or no cost of living allowance applied in 2020. For 2021, the cost of living adjustment will amount to $102,100. That amounts to the equivalent of about a 1.8% tax levy increase. Now, the cost provision summarized in the next category here. So the insurance, legal, supplies, maintenance, less new revenue. Essentially, the request here summarizes cost provisions that reflect inflationary cost pressures during the year. So we're looking at things like liability insurance, increases in liability insurance premiums, supplies and services, legal services, and that inflationary cost pressure has been netted against additional taxation revenue from new construction and development fees. So essentially, there is $55,000 of new revenue that is coming in that has been offset against what's required. So we've got basically new product coming on, or new houses are coming on the roll, which will mean new taxation, which amounts to about, I believe, close to $50,000.
Awesome.
Now, we also have a request for FTEs, which represents the additional resources that are needed across various areas in the municipality to address service delivery challenges and to be able to deliver the services as per the various municipal plans and policies. I had addressed a number of those in the staff report. So that funding is actually representative of 6.9 new FTEs at a cost of about $466,400 that would be required to address this challenge. And that would represent an 8.2% increase to the tax levy. This particular item that's titled Council Strategic Initiatives Reserves. Now, essentially, operating projects that need one-time funding are within the normal scope of ongoing operations. So there is currently no internal funding source for these type of projects. This would include projects that are approved by council as part of the council strategic initiatives, such as the asset management plan, initiatives related to short-term rentals, the various housing initiative projects, and for example, things like the core services review that we had done last year, or any internal services reviews that we do. So the proposal here is to establish an annual funding provision for a contribution to an operating reserve that would be dedicated to funding operating projects that are approved by council as part of the budget process. So establishing this annual funding provision and reserve will facilitate in establishing a funding source for operating projects, which currently doesn't exist. So an annual total provision of $75,000 is proposed. The reason this number is a little bit higher is because there are a number of smaller initiatives that are related to council strategic initiatives that total $18,700 that were requested individually. So if a funding provision to the reserve was approved, then those smaller initiatives that are here would probably either disappear or they would just have a one-time impact in 2021. And when I say disappear, I mean they would be funded out of that provision. They wouldn't actually disappear. So in terms of all prioritized needs, all in, there is a pressure of $863,000 in 2021. And if we were to take a look at that on an increasing scale, the gray bar here just shows the cumulative effect of each of those requests that totals up to the 15.5%. And if we were to have a 15.5% increase in the tax rate, which I know is very highly unlikely, it would result in about a $380 a year impact on the average assessed property at $1,083,000. So realizing that this is an extremely high tax rate increase, we've developed a number of scenarios that would show you what we're able to do. And so so actually, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to summarize the scenario. So the first scenario actually shows a tax asset reserve contribution equivalent to a 1.5% tax rate increase of $84,000. Staff felt that the cost of living allowance will have to be done this year, given that we didn't implement that last year, or we basically in an effort to keep last year's tax rate down. It's not something that municipalities would typically do. Otherwise, your staff would fall behind in their wages in comparison to the market. And we're addressing a net 38,000 in the supplies and inflation provision. And we're basically requesting a minimum of 0.6 FTE for a new HR position and a 0.2 FTE for bylaws position. Essentially, if I had expanded on those in my report to council, but the HR position was deemed necessary by staff. Currently, HR is being done by finance and by individual managers in each of the departments. And it would be far more efficient to have a dedicated resource, and staff felt they needed a HR resource in-house as well. And the bylaws position comes as a result of making whole a 0.8 FTE position to be a full-time position. And that requirement also arises out of restructuring that was done in 2020. So all in, a 5% tax rate increase would require about $291,000 from tax levy funding. And that would leave $572,000 worth of needed resources unaddressed. In terms of the impact on the community, a 5% increase would have an impact of would imply a $125 increase from the previous year for the average assessed home on Bowen Island, which is assessed at $1,083,000. So the second scenario that we looked at went up by 1.5%. So it's a 6.6% scenario. And essentially, the additional items that are included in this scenario are a $9,000 increase for the inflationary factor here for supplies and for operating expenses rather. And the new FTE provision stays the same as in the previous scenario, and it calls for a $50,000 contribution to the reserve for strategic initiatives to address operating projects. And this scenario would actually have a total tax levy impact of $378,000, and it would leave $485,000 of needs not addressed in 2021. It would have a cost implication of about $157,000 to the average assessed, or to the property assessed at the average value of $1,083,000 on Bowen. And this is the scenario that staff are considering going to public consultation with and presenting to the community as part of the 2021 budget.
And Raj, I just want to be clear that this scenario also represents a 2% increase to the asset reserve rather than the 1.5 in scenario 1. So you can see that asset reserve grows. The contribution to the asset reserve grows over scenario 1.
And just so nobody confuses it, the 157 contribution here is $32 more than scenario 1 per year. So it's not an additional 157. That's the total impact.
Okay.
The third scenario, or scenario 3 that we looked at, essentially, calls for additional resources or additional FTE resources. And it will actually, fire services had requested a number of resources that came out of recommendations from the core services review. And so they were requesting a 1.0 FTE increase for administrative support. We're able to address 0.5 of that increase in this scenario. Parks, for parks, this is a parks operator position. There was a 1.0 FTE requested there amongst other FTE requests, but we're able to grant that in addition to scenario 2. And our emergency planning coordinator currently works 15 hours a week, and that number of hours is not sufficient to address the planning needs and requirements of the municipality. So we're looking at increasing that by a 0.2 FTE. And this scenario would bring us up to an additional cost of $459,000, which would have to be raised from the tax levy. And that would leave almost half of the provisions required not addressed in 2021. And it would have a cost impact of $196 on the average assessed value property on Bowen. And the last scenario we looked at was scenario 4, and it allows us to actually increase, allows us to provide for additional HR resources. We would, and with this option, we would increase the HR function to also provide support in administration and finance. We could make the parks operator position a 1 whole FTE by adding an additional 0.5 FTE here. And we would increase the council strategic, the contribution to the council strategic initiatives reserve to $75,000. And that would result in a total tax levy requirement of additional $539,000. And it would leave just about $324,000 of the additional required resources unaddressed in 2021, and would have a tax rate implication of $233,000 to the average assessed home on Bowen Island. There's a lot of information on this slide, so maybe I'll pause here for a sec before I move on to the next slide and ask if there's any questions to this point.
Yeah, I got a quick one there, Gary.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Rob?
so as far as the asset renewal, so we have been doing 1.5% in the past. Is that correct, Raj?
That's correct.
So why? So now we're thinking of going up by 0.5 to 2%, right?
Correct.
That's correct. That takes us to the 112.
So I'm wondering, because we've already been doing the 1.5, why is there a 2% jump in the tax rate when we've already embedded the 1.5 in past practices? Or is that every year it's going up like that?
So it's gone, Rob, it's gone up every year, and essentially probably about 10 years ago, municipalities started realizing that, hey, we have all this aging infrastructure and we don't have the money to take care of it. So they started applying increases to their tax rates. Those municipalities that hadn't been doing it for a while, like when I was in West Vancouver, for example, we did a 5.5% increase in 1 year just for asset management and for increasing our contribution to reserves. The District of North Vancouver, for example, has been doing 1 or 1.5% for the last 15 years and continues doing it. So there's municipalities that are further ahead of us and there's municipalities that are further behind than us. But essentially this annual increase is required to get our asset reserve balances to a place where we're able to adequately fund our aging infrastructure through reserves.
Thanks, Raj.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Allison?
I'm just wondering, where's the fire department clerical position in all of this?
So the fire department clerical position comes in scenario 3. You see a 0.5 fire service position here. So currently that position is been filled on a temporary basis, Allison, and we're looking to make it permanent, and we don't have the thing in the prioritized scenarios 1 and 2. It makes its way in scenario 3 and becomes, and then comes in there.
All right, Allison?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have their hand up in here? I didn't see anybody here.
Yeah, I've got
David, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Gary. And Raj, thanks. This is really an excellent presentation, and it's really quite clear. But my question is, I mean, the differences between scenarios 2, 3, and 4. Well, between 1 and 2, I want the 2%, so I'm not interested in scenario 1. But scenario 2 to 3, it's all in the FTEs. And so, are we going to get to the details, a detailed discussion of each of those? Is that the differences? You know, what's in, what's out? Is that still to come, or is that in a more detailed presentation later? how does that work?
So I think that'll be part of the council deliberation when we come forward with a budget proposal, Michael. Or
David.
yeah, sorry, David.
So that's not today, that's later?
That's not today. Today is more information, and then the deliberation of that would come in when we come forward to council with a with a proposed budget. Now, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Liam, you want to have part of that discussion today or not, or what we should have that discussion look like if we do have it today.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to field more questions and and to have discussion around it. And David, if maybe I can recap what we're proposing there. So under scenario 1 and scenario 2, it's basically the same FTE request, and we're looking for basically a half-time dedicated HR person. And that came out very clearly from our all staff survey that we did this summer. And that was a very clear and strong request from all staff to get a dedicated HR resource. And then also to make one of our bylaw officers' salary position a full-time from a 0.8 to a full-time position. And we did a internal staff reorganization this year, and that's really a necessary shuffle. So we would increase the bylaw complement to 2 dedicated full-time. Right now it's 1.8 full-time. When we move from scenario 2 to scenario 3, we're then saying, okay, we want to keep the half HR position and the 0.2 increase for bylaw, but now we also, the next highest priority item is to allocate a 0.5 budget contribution to the fire services administrative position. So the clerk position that Allison was just asking about, and then a 0.5 for parks, and then a 0.2 for emergency planning. And then scenario 4 adds on top of that, takes the HR position from a 0.6 and makes it actually a full-time position, but it'd be split between HR and finance and admin support. And then we add on another 0.5 to parks, so it makes the parks position a full-time position. Right now, parks are managed by one person from an operations perspective, or one FTE. And so this would enable the parks operator to have a support person, and that would greatly support not only efficiencies and effectiveness of delivering on park priority work, but also greatly improve the safety of the operations. And we really felt like those were, and these were in discussions with all the management team too as well. What are the priorities? Because there are several more FTE priorities that we didn't bring forward in these scenarios. Included in those other priorities is a request for another roads crew member, because we currently have 3, and it would be ideal to have 4, so we'd have 2 teams of 2. It provides more safety and more effective service delivery. And then we also have a request from the library to increase the staff time to their existing staff complement so that they can increase the hours that they can be open and operating. We also have another request from Public Works for an admin support, which would greatly support their ability to deliver on projects and to take on more strategic planning on how we manage our capital assets. And then we do also have another HR request or FTE request as well to bring our building clerk position to a full-time position, so that we can have that person in the office 5 days a week instead of 4, so we can handle the increasing demand on operating or building permit requests and other building service needs.
Thanks, Liam. This is really an excellent set of information. This, along with the material that was sent out to us earlier. I think what would help for me and probably others to really understand the differences is to go back to those early reports, the ones that had all the FTE positions outlined, and then put a little note beside it, scenario 1, scenario 2, which one's in which scenario. Then I could just sort of see, okay, yeah, I get why that was in that scenario, and I see we're still leaving out this. I thought it was important, but I understand why, and so on. But because I read through all those and they all seemed reasonable, and I'd like to include all of them, but obviously can't. But really seeing how each one adds into each scenario helps really get a grasp of what we're getting and what we're still missing. So thanks so much for all this information. I think it's really useful and helps understand this, helps me understand it really well.
Okay, well, we can do that.
Thank you, David. Over to Sue Ellen.
Thank you. I think this is a great presentation too. Thank you very much. I'm supportive of the 2% for the asset reserve, because we not only do we have aging infrastructure, but we've got climate change, and we've seen a couple of culverts and a public wharf piling in big storms a couple of years ago. So I think we're going to need to keep a better eye on our infrastructure, and I like the idea of saving up for it. My question is for Raj, when is a good time to bring up the idea of parcel taxes for water moving into this property tax scenario? Because with COVID, I'm concerned about supporting our residents and I guess businesses, and so everybody on Bowen, and increasing our community resilience to shocks like COVID or whatever might be coming, so that we can keep our diversity of people living here, and so we don't lose seniors from the island, people on fixed incomes, that kind of thing, as one of the letters that we've received recently. So my own water bill comes to more than any of these property taxes, and that's just once in a year. I like the idea of paying by your property value as is listed here, rather than everybody from the smallest little humble cottage to the biggest house paying the same as we do, I think, for some parcel taxes. Can you tell me when in the process would be a good time to raise this question and ask staff for information?
I guess I'm not quite clear on what your question is. I think what you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sue Ellen, is what I'm understanding you're saying is that the water, you want the water utility rates to be part of the property tax and associated with your property value rather than being a utility rate.
That's what I'm interested in. I understand that parcel taxes are sort of flat and everybody pays the same. But I don't know whether that's an appropriate part of this discussion or not.
So I think we would need to have a totally separate discussion on that, because that is a huge topic. Typically, water rates or local area service charges are for a specific, water utilities are typically required to provide the funding for the expenditures of operating each water utility, and that's the way
okay, Raj,
is established. So you're talking about changing a whole structure of how we charge for things, and so that would be a much larger discussion than a budget discussion.
Okay, that's great. I understand it's apples and oranges. I just thought if there was a way to begin that discussion here, when would that begin? And I'm hearing no. So that's fine. I'm just, I'm keen to keep people that want to live on Bowen still able to live on Bowen with these necessary increases. So thank you for your answering my question.
Okay, thank you, Sue Ellen. Maureen?
Thanks, Gary. My question, and this may not be the time to ask it, but it's about the sort of larger picture. What we know at this point of the taxes that will be coming from other levels of government and agencies. Do we have any information related to that? A heads up on what we can expect from Islands Trust and Metro and so forth on an average house basis?
So I believe Sue Ellen had shared with us, and I've received an email that the Islands Trust levy is not going up. In fact, there may be a slight
Decrease.
but so I would say that the Islands Trust will be flat for all intensive purposes in terms of the levy to residents.
And that means roughly how much?
Pardon?
It's going down. Most recently, as of a few days ago, it was a decrease of 4.5%.
Yeah, I'm always interested in the absolute numbers. You know,
Just
4%.
under $300,000.
And at this point, to answer your question, Maureen, we don't have information on all of the other taxes. So our discussion is focused just on the municipal levy. And that is how all municipalities approach the budget cycle, is they're only able to talk about the municipal aspect at this point. We won't know until March or April what the full impact of those other levies will be.
Okay, it's just, I know there are some folks who are watching on YouTube, and from the taxpayer's perspective, they feel the impact of all of those taxes. So they'll be considering any municipal taxation in the larger context of what's the bottom line going to be for me come next tax time.
And I agree. And I think part of our public consultation message, I mean, I haven't hit on that here, will be very clear to articulate we're only talking about the municipal budget here, and that we don't at this point recognize, or we don't know what the increases from the external agencies will be. But generally speaking, the external agencies component of taxpayers' bills represents about 50% of their bill.
Thank you. And I didn't say this earlier, but I think this is a really excellent presentation, Raj. Thank you.
I've had a lot of help from Liam as well. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. And back to Allison.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Raj. This really lays it out nicely to be able to compare. And in that line, is it possible to add scenario 5, which is the 15.5 one, which would then show us what's in and what's out, and we'd be able to look at that?
I think I did that in the previous slide, but I mean, it would make it a pretty crowded slide to put another scenario in here. I mean, I could do it on an 11 by 17 sheet of paper.
Or an legal size.
Council, but we do have scenario, the full scenario or the full.
Well, can you go back to previous slide? Because I didn't think it was laid out the same way.
Oh, it was a little bit, it was laid out slightly different. Oh, I can't get back to it, Allison, right now.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? It's going to have to go piece by piece. I can go back to it. Hold on. It's right here.
Oh, yeah. It's not, it doesn't show as nicely as neatly because it doesn't have all the detail about the different salary positions and everything.
Yeah, I actually, all of that information is included in the, actually,
yeah, I'm just thinking about laying it out simply for the public and saying, you know, if we did the 15.5, this is everything, but we're cutting these things out. You know, and I guess I've got some own personal questions about the priorities where, you know, and I can't, you know, just sort of be, you know. Now, my other question is on the FTEs. I'm looking at the org chart that was in the 2019 annual report. And where does bylaw fit in? I mean, there's talk about a reorg. So in 2019, what was the bylaw count FTE?
So, sorry, it wasn't really a reorg. Sorry, my earlier comment was more a reshuffle. So we actually had a bylaw officer move to the utilities group, and we were just in this fortuitous situation where the there was a person in the utilities group that was interested in becoming a bylaw officer. And so through our HR process, we were able to, ensure that both candidates met the needs of both departments, and they were each individually able to move to the respective departments.
So I guess my question is, how many FTEs did we have in bylaw in 2019? And is this an actual increase in the number of FTEs in bylaw?
Yes.
Okay, so why are we adding a 0.2 FTE to bylaws?
Well, two primary reasons, and one is we're seeing a significant increase in bylaw activity. So the demands on the bylaw officer's time is increasing, and then two, additionally, it supports the needs of the staff to provide that that ability to offset each other, so that we're able to have consistent bylaw coverage across the
That's
work.
the reason I raise that is every time we've ever done a survey of the public and asked about, what parts of the budget would you think we needed to, you'd support raising tax dollars to increase. Everybody's quite happy with the level of bylaw service.
Right. Well, I mean, in my short time here, I have noticed a tremendous amount of activity in the bylaw department, and we only have less than 2 staff and complement allocated to it, but yet the amount of time that bylaw services requires is dramatic. I mean, I myself get pulled into bylaw issues, which is not uncommon, but sometimes if there was greater bylaw support, myself and other senior management likely wouldn't need to be pulled in to help resolve bylaw issues. I've witnessed a significant demand on bylaw time.
And I guess my last question is just the going back to sort of the background and the introductory process. So did anybody, in looking at their budgets and looking at their operations, and we've been doing things differently for COVID, did anybody come back and say, well, we really don't need to keep on doing this, or we could do this way, which would cost us less? Or are we basically taking everything we were doing for 2019 budget and adding all these other things to it?
We do encourage staff to look at that, and really there was only a couple of areas where there might have been an opportunity to say, okay, and in most cases, well, in both cases that I can think about right now off the top of my head, it wasn't a matter of like that we could stop doing that work, rather it was that we could deprioritize that work, and that would then mean that we're reducing the capacity. So one example was in the planning department, and it was actually about like, would we reconsider how we're dealing with subdivision developments, and it would reduce the amount of staff complement that we would have to address subdivision issues. And my feeling is that the amount of work and priorities that we have on the go around subdivision is that wouldn't be a wise choice for us, because it would result in putting a lot of pressure on our manager of planning, and who would have to take up that additional work. So really, the only opportunities where we see reductions of FTEs or reductions of programming is really about reducing the level of service, not,
So if I can add to that, I mean, managers did look for opportunities to reallocate before they requested additional resources. And an example that comes to mind, Allison, is the fire services department, where they had a provision for contract training, and they've now hired an internal training officer, which they already had budget for. So they were able to reallocate about $47,000 in costs towards other increased pressures that they'll be facing in 2021. So there was a reallocation made there of existing resources to pay for other resources that are required, that were identified as, and they were all identified as part of the core services review as well.
Yeah, Gary.
Okay, I'll save my rest. I'll let you finish the slides before I ask any more.
Gary.
Thank you, Alison. Is that Michael?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Gary, Raj really has done an excellent job of laying this out in front of us. And I cannot imagine with the 1.5 to 2 being a tremendously lengthy conversation. In fact, I think the conversation will be almost singularly focused on the growth of our municipal staffing. And I suppose I'm going to ask kind of a little bit, maybe in the same vein as Alison, you know, all programs necessary, advances on the way we do things now through COVID. Really, it's just every year these organizations, whether it's Islands Trust, whether it's our municipality, it's add. And I think you're going to get some pushback on that. So whilst, of course, every increase is always justified, it's never not justified, but I see that as being a contentious issue. And I realize this is we're talking about explaining ourselves. And I am really concerned because you can see where the growth is. And that's the one, as individual councillors, I think we often get questioned on how many staff have you got? How many staff has it? How has the staff grown, et cetera, et cetera. It's wearisome. And looking at this excellent presentation, that's the area that comes into sharp focus and bothers me the most.
Right. Well, thank you for that. That's a really good point of concern, and we hear you loud and clear there. And you know, I'd like to offer up one comparison. I don't like to get into doing comparisons too much, but I hear it a lot about comparing our tax rates or our levels of service and our budgets to other municipalities. And you know, Bowen Island municipality actually is fairly lean. It seems like we have a large staff complement, but you know, a lot of our staff are part-time. So when we look at the total FTE equivalency, it's actually not as big as it might look from the total amount of staff. When we think about our neighbors, some of our neighboring municipalities, we're quite a lot lower in the staff per capita than our neighbors are. If we look at West Vancouver, for example, they have about twice as many staff per capita as Bowen Island does. I know it's a totally different community. They offer a much wider suite of services and perhaps more complex services, but we're often getting compared to West Vancouver and North Vancouver and places like that. So put that into real numbers. For every one person in West Vancouver, or sorry, for every staff in West Vancouver, they serve 55 people. And for every one staff on Bowen is serving 98 people. So I do want to put it into context that we are quite lean in comparison to some of our neighbor communities, but yet the expectation of the level of service is quite high. So it's a really good point though, Michael. I really do appreciate that.
Gary, I put my hand back up.
Yeah, just going to chirp in on that one. I agree with what Michael had to say, is that it does seem to be an area of concern for the taxpayers as more staff. And I think it's got to be related to growth, which is your point, Liam, and the fact that we are fairly efficient in the way we operate. So, but you know, if you look at it, the FTE was going to be about half of the entire budget. If we went the whole thing, half of the budget was in the FTEs. So it's a communication piece. I think that people have to understand that, you know, with the increased services and the increased population that there's going to be, and the building that's going on in the island is that we're going to require, we need more planners and people like that. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Okay, Allison, back to you.
So just commenting on Liam's comment about staff per capita, you've got to be careful that you're not comparing apples and oranges. I'm assuming in that staff number for West Van is their fire department, which is all paid staff, and their police department, which is all paid staff. Neither really which we have. So if you just compared, you know, and then you go look at Gibson's and they say, okay, they're the same size community we are, but that's not going to be comparable because their parks and recreation function is all done by the regional district. So it's really, you've got to sort of dig under before you can actually, you know, compare. So just being cautious. And I had one other thought, which has now just gone right out of my head. It was related to Gary's. Well, I guess the other question is the philosophy thing. Like, we need more staff for development, but if our development application fees they should cover maybe not 100% because there is community interest, but the applicant should pay for the bulk of the cost of processing their application. And
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why my earlier comment in the sort of opening remarks is that we really need to revisit our fees and charges.
So we used to do an awful lot of cost recovery agreements. So if it was a big complex rezoning or subdivision, the applicant paid extra, not just the standard fees. And we entered into cost recovery programs with them. And, you know, it might have meant hiring an outside person to process it, but we haven't done that much lately.
Well, as you'll note from the report that Raj submitted, and it's not up here in detail, so I apologize for that, but the pressure on the FTE area isn't in the planning department.
No, I know that.
It's the pressure is on the operations of our core services around utilities, roads, parks, fire. That's where the pressure really lies. So our planning department is doing a good job at keeping pace. We do have to improve our fees and charges to make sure that new development pays for itself. But where we're really feeling the pressure is from demands from the public to have, you know, adequate levels of service and higher levels of service, and for those core services.
That brings me to my other comment, which is we need to maybe look at our levels of service, and, you know, because of the way we're getting things given to us at the time of rezonings or subdivisions, are we opening ourselves up for huge amounts of more ongoing costs from a maintenance and operations perspective? And, you know, maybe we need to, you know, think about things like dead end roads. It's hard for a snowplow to do a loop, just as one example, or a trail that instead of being on the side of the road is off, you know, 50 feet away, is maybe harder to maintain than one that's at the trail. So I think there's a whole bunch of level of service conversations we could maybe have.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I agree, Allison. There's absolutely no question that we have to have a really close look at all of that. We can't be going, just because somebody's developing it, we can't be paying for it. So that's just got to be an overriding concept that we take a good look at. Let's, if nobody's got anything else, let's move on a bit. I think there's probably lots to cover here. If everybody's okay with this at this level. Okay, thank you. Back to you then, Raj.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So our next slide here is actually talking about 1% tax levy increases in comparison, which is to the point that Michael had made earlier in the previous presentation. So a 1% tax increase on Bowen Island is equivalent to $56,700. I know my slide says 57.6. It's not the greatest thing to have a CFO who transposes his numbers every once in a while. But so it's 56,700. And that amount of funding would probably be able to fund the equivalent of a 0.7 FTE position. When you take a look at an increase of 1% in West Vancouver or Burnaby, for example, 1% increase in West Vancouver is over $1 million, and a 1% increase in Burnaby is over $3 million. So a 1% tax increase in a municipality like Burnaby would be able to fund the equivalent of 39 FTE positions.
Wow.
And so the only point that this slide is trying to make is to be careful when you say Burnaby has a 2% tax rate increase. So we should stick with what Burnaby has. 2% can buy you, or 1 or 2% can buy you a lot of different things in Burnaby than what it can buy you on Bowen Island. That was the only reason for including this slide here.
No, I think it's very worthwhile.
So in terms of the project budget, essentially this is a little bit of a repeat from the previous presentation on reserves. So essentially $5.2 million of requests was received for 2021. I'm only focusing on the 2021 year. We managed to defer 1.8 million in the renewal and replacement area. So we have a request for a renewal and replacement capital projects of $2.9 million. We've investment in new assets, 228. I'll talk a little bit more about each of the details in each classification here in subsequent slides. Operating projects of 178, most of which are funded through grant funding, you'll see later on, for a total capital, a proposed capital budget of $3.3 million. Now the numbers up here only include new requests that came in 2021. So it's not including projects like the community center, other projects that were approved, the multi-use path, for example, that were approved in 2020 and budgets will be carried forward because those are not new requests. Those had been already accounted for coming out of reserves and funded in 2021, and we'll carry the unspent portion forward. We will report them incomplete during the budget consultation period so that the community knows what projects are on the go. However, for the purposes of this presentation, we've limited the inclusion of new requests for approval. I'm going to jump into the next few slides because some of your questions that are probably arising out of this slide might be answered in the next few slides here. So in terms of our major renewal and replacement projects, we're essentially need to replace a number of culverts. There were 4 culverts that were identified, and we've actually put a budget provision in for 2. One is on Smugglers Cove Road near Hood Point, and the other one's at Harding Road. There's essentially drainage improvements at Hikers Trail Road. So when I say significant project, almost every one of these projects is in excess of $100,000. The culvert replacements that I believe represent about $400,000 worth of a funding request. The drainage improvement at Hikers Trail, I believe, was in the $100,000 range. Then we have the replacement of the fire hall and engine number 31. We have the roads renewal program, which has $400,000 in it. The library sewer connection, which is just, I believe it's in the $150,000 range. We have the development of service yard plans. So essentially we've got our equipment and supplies are spread over at Mount Gardner and Salal. So this would be part of the asset management and the plan for what we're going to do with our service yard. This isn't the actual replacement. This is the planning for what our service yard should look like. And I believe that that provision is in excess of $100,000 as well. And then we also have, we own a number of structures throughout the municipality. And so we're looking to get condition assessments for all of those so we can come up with a plan on how to address. So we can first of all get a comprehensive listing and get a condition assessment on all of those structures and then develop a plan for how to address and tackle the replacement and renewal of those structures. So in terms of our, so those are our significant new renewal and replacement projects proposed in the budget. And of course, there are a number of smaller initiatives, and you were provided with a comprehensive listing of all of them in the package. However, as we go forward with budget presentation, we'll limit it to those that are included in the $0.9 million number here.
Raj, just a quick question.
Go ahead, Raj.
I'll go back a slide, sorry.
It helps when you give us rough numbers. So I got the drainage at 100K, the fire hall and engine, what is fire hall / engine 31? What's the number there?
I believe there's probably about 600, and don't quote me on that, I don't have the number in front of me, but it was about, was it 640 that was for the fire engine? I know Aaron's on the line, otherwise I can go back to the report. I'll update those numbers for you, Rob, but I believe there's 400 and something that was approved by council for the fire hall as part of the funding strategy. And,
yeah.
And then there's engine 31 replacement, which I believe is of 670,000 if I'm correct.
So we're talking over $1 billion. Okay.
Allison, did you have your hand up?
No,
Okay, thank you.
If not, I'll move on to I'll get, well, I mean, I will have exact numbers in part of the public consultation and further budget materials that will come forward. Each project will be identified by category with amounts beside it. So this is, again, just give you context in terms of what the significant projects are. And in terms of our investments in new assets, proposing the acquisition of a portable traffic light, which would actually not require us to have traffic flaggers when we're doing road works. And we're also need the generator for the new fire hall. And then there is a number of protective equipment needs in fire services, which are not replacement, but are additional equipment. So for example, as a outcome of COVID, there's more SCBA, like additional masks required and additional equipment, because right now some of that equipment is being shared, is my understanding. And then we have additional funding that's required for the multi-use path phase 1 construction, in addition to the budget provision that is already included.
Yep.
And in terms of our operating projects, most of these projects are 100% grant funded and will proceed only if the grant funding materializes. So the evacuation route planning is an emergency planning grant, the emergency operations center capacity building. We're also looking at creating a community wildfire resilience plan, a pre-incident plan creation, and then creation of fire department standard operating guidelines. So all of these projects are anticipated to be 100% funded through grant funding. And then we have the asset management improvement of data quality, which is the next phase of asset management that we require funding for to move forward on the asset management plan. There is an outstanding grant of $15,000, which we didn't use in 2020, and I've received an extension to use that in 2021. That's a matching funds grant.
All right.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead, Maureen.
Raj, do any of these operating projects also have an allowance for staff costs? It's essentially an overhead.
Yes, I believe they do. Some of them allow for the recovery of staff costs spent on them.
So that could potentially help with the emergency and the fire services positions?
It could, but it wouldn't be the best recommendation to rely on grant funding to fund an ongoing position, because it will create an additional pressure in a future period. But to answer your question, yes, that did alleviate some of the pressure. For example, in 2020, we were able to recover a lot of time that the emergency management coordinator spent on working on these grant activities but it also allowed her to, it was time over and above what was budgeted for in the budget. So even though we incurred additional costs, it was the additional costs that were typically recovered, not her core 15 hours that she spent on municipality activities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else to this point? All right, move on then.
So the next couple of slides here deal with the Finance Advisory Committee recommendations, and these ones are copied verbatim. So I'm hopefully I don't have mistakes in them and don't have the level of confusion like I did at the previous presentation, which I apologize for. So essentially, again, this is the first section is dealing with the whereases of having received the reports for the reserves and the report on the 2021 budget pressures. And essentially, the third whereas here makes reference to all of the various policies have that will guide us through the budgeting process. I don't know if you guys want me to read through them or whether you've read through the next slide, or you want me to just pause here and give you an opportunity to read through the slide and let me know when I can move to the next one.
Yep, I've read it.
We've read them.
Okay, so hearing it's unanimous to move forward. Essentially, the first recommendation here is actually limiting the spending from new asset reserves to a maximum of $275 a year on investment in new assets. So the financial plan that's being proposed in each of the outer 5 years, contribution to new assets is $275. And to the point that Michael made earlier, actually really good, was that essentially they're talking about funding from asset reserves. So the example of the composter, which is funded through other funding sources, it would still allow us to continue with funding projects where we're borrowing or receiving grants that exceed the $275,000.
Right.
And each of the and this recommendation, the second one here, actually calls for minimum balances in the reserve for asset management and for replacement and renewal of asset reserves or assets. And each of the outgoing 5 years, the balance exceeds the minimum that has been specified by the Finance Advisory Committee. And it is good to have a minimum balance in your reserves for something that may come up on an unanticipated basis. And myself being very, very conservative, I would feel uncomfortable myself personally going down to these levels. But if we absolutely needed to, I'm glad that the Finance Advisory Committee has recommended the flexibility to do that.
Raj, can I add to that?
Certainly.
I think the reason we put that it starts in at 500, it's building up because the presentation we had, the whole of the capital replacement and renewal fund would have been wiped out in year one, if I'm remembering correctly.
Well,
So
even
this
the
is to get it built
presentation
back up.
and even the presentation that I gave, Allison, if we were to fund everything that's required, it would be wiped out in year one.
Yeah.
So the presentation I provided council with is consistent with the one that was given to the Finance Advisory Committee.
And I think also, just adding to that, I think also in between the Finance Advisory Committee meeting where we discussed reserves and now, we've had a number of conversations with the Director of Engineering and Fire Services and the Acting Chief about what can we defer, because those are the two departments with the largest capital expenditures and asset renewal expenditures, and we were able to better identify what the priority items were, so that enabled Raj to build a better plan forward.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else? Okay, let's move along then. Thank you.
Okay, and then, so essentially Did I have all of the I'm missing a couple of recommendations here.
Hmm.
Oh, sorry, let me go back to that one. There were 4 recommendations in total. Oh, there's 2, sorry. So in the whereases, there were 2 recommendations at the bottom of this page, which I missed. So one of the recommendations was that council direct staff to develop a series of options for a maximum tax increase in taxes of 5% for consideration, and that council direct staff to develop a series of options for additional maximum tax increase of 1.5% for consideration to determine whether an extraordinary increase provides sufficient additional benefits for taxpayer support. So those were the scenarios that I provided earlier, and 5% was the, that was one of the scenario, the very first scenario, which staff feels is an absolute minimum tax increase that is required for 2021. And essentially, the last slide I have in the presentation here is just highlighting the next steps in the budget process. So we would like to commence public engagement by getting the information into our citizen budget platform and posting information online before we actually host our budget public consultation sessions in the middle of January. And then we propose to come back to council with a budget for consideration that will include public comments on the budget as well.
All right. Thank you, Raj. Any comments on that little piece there? Anybody? What scenario are you thinking of going forward with? What's the?
I'll go back to that slide. So we are thinking of going forward with scenario 2.
Okay.
Why
The only
not?
difference.
And one of the reasons for that is, I mean, the way we look at it, it's essential that we have an asset reserve contribution of 2%, which is recommended by Finance Advisory Committee. I believe Council and the Finance Advisory Committee are supportive of the policy-based increase for salaries, given that that didn't happen last year.
Correct.
So essentially, we've got a very small provision, inflationary provision here. And we've only included what is absolutely critical in terms of the new FTEs in this scenario. And it's extremely important, I believe, to have a funding provision for operating projects, which we don't have. So it assures that it can carry out on its strategic initiatives and items that come up through the strategic planning process. It's currently no funding source for that.
Yeah, we took a big chunk out of that last year, didn't we? Or did we?
Actually, we didn't. I proposed that last year as well, Gary, and it was completely removed as part of the effort to get the tax levy down.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. All right. That's interesting. Anybody else got any questions here for Raj?
Me.
Okay, go ahead, Alison.
So I'm just looking at scenario 4, Raj, and it doesn't have $1 for an average tax increase.
Oh, it's probably because I went far too back.
Oh, there we go. Okay. And then if I'm looking at it's small print, the 539 is kind of blocking off the total.
It's the total there is 324, I believe. It's 263 plus 61.
Okay, so you've got supplies, FTE, and so if I went and looked at, if we put those 2 things in, that would get us to the 15.5%.
If we put the remaining FTE requests in and the inflationary provision, I believe there's a difference in the inflationary provision from the previous slide. I can provide you with that information after the presentation as well.
Yeah, because you just said provisions not provided, and I guess I was trying to figure out, what had been left out to get to the 15.5. So if I just added
that's basically it. So you just add those.
You added those, you get to the 15.5. Yeah, sorry, I didn't add.
Okay.
Really.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that I'll leave it for now. I mean, I've got lots more comments about getting into the weeds, but you don't want to do that. So
All right, thank you, Allison. And okay, back to you, Raj, or is that complete your presentation this time?
That is the end of the slides in my presentation. I'm happy to take any further questions anybody may have.
Okay.
I think I have a question.
Raj, is there a chance you're going to make a few small alterations where you've gone through? I wouldn't mind a copy of this just being sent to me separately when you, and I'm sure the others, when you make necessary changes.
I'll provide Hope with a copy, and I'll send a copy of the slides to, or ask Hope to send it along with the minutes of the meeting.
Thanks, Raj.
We'll get that out to everybody, and I'll make sure I correct those recommendations that I messed up on earlier.
Yeah, no worries. That was a great presentation, Raj. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent.
Question?
Sorry, go ahead, Maureen. Yeah.
We recently received the 1.3 million odd in COVID relief. I could see it being a question arising in the mind of a member of the public as to whether those funds might be used to reduce the impact of these increases. Do you have any comments on that?
My thoughts on that, Maureen, are they should not be used because they would essentially just create an additional pressure in a future year. So what we're talking about here is ongoing costs of providing services, and we shouldn't be using a one-time grant or funding source to fund those types of requirements, because it'll just add on to the pressures in subsequent years. Liam may want to add to that as well.
Yeah, Raj is exactly right. So we're trying to identify these are ongoing provisions that would need a sustainable source of funding. We will definitely use the 1.3 million for good uses. And it may be able to help address some of the needs identified, you know, maybe even in some of the FTE areas as a provision for, you know, temporary support. But it has to be identified and very clear that it's a temporary support that's helping offset impacts from COVID and the nature of such.
I'm thinking particularly about the emergency and the fire services. Those are comparatively small amounts to continue or extend someone's employment in the short run, at least.
Right, and yeah, and I would agree, and I do know with the fire services that we want to get us to a place where that is a permanent budgeted position, and so we're not having to do sort of annual patches to make sure that it's funded. Another good example is the library request for FTE increases. It really came about because of COVID and their inability to have all of the volunteer staffing complement that they usually have. And so that may be a good opportunity to provide some funds to support the library, increasing their staffing time temporarily until we can get to a place where we can more adequately have volunteers. I know the preference from Tina is that to have a bit more paid staff time doing the work that volunteers have been doing for going forward, but this might be a good temporary measure.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to see a huge amount of that grant being used for this purpose, but I could see it being of value in the short run.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Maureen. Anybody else?
Hey.
Okay, Allison.
Just sort of a couple of comments. I'm also thinking the additional reading apparatus that we're needing because COVID won't let us split could be covered off by that grant. And for the fire department. And then I'm also wondering about the, an FTE is how many hours a week?
30 hours a week is a full-time FTE.
Sorry, you broke up, Raj.
Oh, 35 hours a week.
35.
is a
Okay, I wasn't
full-time
sure if it's
FTE.
35 or 40. And my last question is, the average house price you were using was how much?
1,083,000.
And that was based on the last year's,
No, it was
right?
based on the preliminary roll for 2021.
Oh, so you've got that.
I've received a preliminary roll from BC Assessment, yes.
And the non-market is only going to give us 50
The
grand.
non-market gives us about $35,000, Allison, and 20,000 was development revenue. So I had in my report included, or I was offsetting the inflationary provision by $55,000 of non-taxation revenue.
But it's non-market. Yeah.
Yeah, the non-market change is $35,000
$20,000
identified through BC Assessment as well.
So does that average house prices down a little bit from last year?
Yeah,
Then, isn't it?
our average assessment, I was actually quite surprised that the average assessment on Bowen for 2021 dropped by about, I believe, 8% in comparison to the Metro Vancouver, where it went up by 10 to 15 or 5 to 15%, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, because the real estate summary that was on the news this morning was saying that, I was expecting ours to go up.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's gone up since. The assessed values are as of July of 2020.
Yeah.
So that's when they kind of cut off for assessing. So.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we might get it. Thanks, Allison. We might get it for next year. Because I see that, I don't know, the prices are pretty hot on Boner. They have been for a while. Okay, well, thanks again, Raj. That was an excellent presentation. I can tell by the amount of questions that it was extraordinarily well presented and easy to comprehend for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now we're going to move on to new business here. So we're going to move to a closed council meeting. And the recommendation is a council move to a closed council meeting to discuss pursuant.
Mary-Ander, sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. I just had a thought, just so we don't have to move back to the committee of the whole, that we do the fire hall item first and then move to a closed. Just to prevent having to come back if everyone's okay with that.
So the fire hall operations wasn't part of the closed then?
No, it's part of the open.
Oh, okay.
So just make that item 4.1 and just switch them.
Okay, let's just switch them around. I didn't understand that. Okay.
Okay, sorry
We
about
will
that.
go to 4.1, which is going to be the Fire Hall and Emergency Operations Center project update. Hope Dallas corporate officer and
Okay.
Aaron Hanen, acting fire chief. Away you
Thank
go.
you, everyone. So this item is on the agenda today, just in response to, so at the October 13th council meeting, council adopted a resolution for staff to proceed with engaging Liberty for the design build contract for the fire hall and EOC building, subject to a legal review. So in that legal review, everything is pretty standard, just minus one item that came up that our legal counsel had an issue with was there was no provision for bonding in the contract. And so a performance bond is also known as a contract bond, and it's basically a surety bond issued by an insurance company or bonding company or a bank that guarantees satisfactory completion of a project by a contractor. So in this instance, our legal counsel felt that it was would be a project of this magnitude and cost would be a risk for BIM. So he suggested that we get a quote from Liberty, and he has said at the outset that it could be from anywhere from 1 to 10%, so 30 to 300,000. And Liberty came back with a quote for 54,259, and that's inclusive of GST. And so that's for performance, labor, and material payment bond for the project. So the recommendation in the report is that the committee of the whole recommend that council approve the additional expenditure so that we can proceed with the negotiations and executing the contract. There's also an alternative recommendation. The council directs staff to proceed with the contract with no provision. So our legal counsel has said that it is it's basically a business decision of council whether they want to take on that risk or have this assurance that the project will be completed to a reasonable level of satisfaction. So that's pretty much it. If there's any questions, please let me know. Or Aaron.
Yeah, let's just see if anybody's got some here.
Gary?
Yeah, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, so my understanding was that the contract we were getting into was pretty, like, we were pretty secure in getting the project in on budget. Like, that was one of the benefits of the methods that we went to secure the builder. So sort of surprised me with this insurance. But just, you know, again, like, we're over where we were originally going to go, and now we got, you know, another 80,000 for a generator for the place as well. That's added on top, and 30 for a hose dryer. Like, it's sort of adding up. Like that's 165,000 extra just over what we already said we would spend. So I don't know if that's a comment or it's
Sorry,
definitely.
Councillor Wynan, I think I'm just sorry. I'm confused by the dryer piece, and those are.
Well, it's just like things like we didn't count on this being part of the fire hall budget. There's 55,000, so that's extra on top of that. But there's also things in this presentation that we've had, for instance, on the generator, which, you know, should have been part of the fire hall budget. So it's just a concern that, you know, now we're more and more and more and more like, where does the cost stop here? So that's my concern with that.
Actually, the generator, Councillor Wynan, was not additional. That was part of what was discussed in previous council meetings, even though it was reported in this budget. It was reported as being an investment in a new asset, but it was in a previous staff report that was provided on funding requested for the fire hall. So it's not in addition, like what was presented in the budget materials is not in addition to what council had already been provided previously, if I can just kind of clarify that point.
Okay, thank you, Raj. Rob, any more? Okay. Anybody else have any? Where's that money going to come from?
Sorry, it is in the report funded from the General Capital Renewal and Replacement Fund. So they will revise their original proposal to include this additional cost.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any more comments on this?
Yeah, just a little more clarification on the generator. We are getting a grant for the generator, and that's part of the reason for the timing, because the grant, if we don't acquire the generator, the grant will disappear. So that's part of that, and Aaron's nodding his head. And the other is the performance bond. That's pretty standard business practice, and it protects us.
Yeah. And I'd like to add to that, and it, you know, I think it was an honest piece that was missed due to the process that was taken. You know, when we first took this project to the market, it was a, you know, grossly overpriced from the market due to the design drawings. And so staff did a great job about being able to negotiate directly with Liberty to bring the project back in alignment with our affordability cap. And but through our tender documents and our tendering process, we would have a bonding provision there that would basically state that any cost would need to include bonding. But because we entered into direct negotiations with Liberty, there were no tender documents. And so that piece was missed. We've gone forward with a standard contract with a standard construction contract that is very tight and very comprehensive. And this is the only outstanding item that we didn't get covered. And so I think it was an honest mistake to have missed that up front, but you know, from my perspective, I would not be comfortable going forward without it. And so I support the recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Absolutely. I don't think anybody would feel good about going forward without it. But I guess there's no other option on that. I mean, I'm just thinking of MIA. Can we get a better deal from them, or Or is it just a totally separate thing?
It's a separate thing. It's this,
Yeah.
the Liberty takes out the bond.
Oh,
And it's
okay.
a very specific market that's a specialty market.
Okay, thank you, Allison. Okay, well, I don't see that we have any choice here. And I
the
will read,
recommendation. Okay,
yeah.
you good.
sure. The council approve an additional expenditure of $54,259 $80 inclusive of GST for performance, labor, and material payment bond for the Fire Hall and Emergency Operations Center project to be included in a revised design build proposal from Liberty Contract Management Incorporated. I move that.
Second it.
Thank you, Michael. And if there's any further discussion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. Go ahead.
Does the source of this money have to be identified in the recommendation?
Well, the Fire Hall project itself is being funded from the Capital Renewal and Replacement Reserve Fund. So that was approved in an earlier resolution, but we can certainly include that.
I'd prefer if it gets
Yep.
stipulated.
Yep, to be funded from the General Capital and Renewal Reserve Fund.
Okay, so any other comments on that? Now ask a question. All in favor of the recommendation as amended? Aye.
Aye.
That's unanimous.
Okay, thanks,
Thank
Hope.
you.
Very good. Thank you very much, everybody. So now we're going to go back and move to a closed meeting. And that's going to be in the update from the Chief Financial Officer, collective bargaining negotiations. And that the recommendation is the council move to a closed council meeting to discuss items pursuant to section 90-1A and C of the community charter. And I have a second for that, please.
Aye.
Somewhere, thank you, Michael. And all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, we
Yes.
did we just move seamlessly from a committee of the whole into a council meeting so we can vote? Or are we making votes that say the committee of the whole recommends that council approve?
That's how the recommendation was written. So it'll be included in the December 14th agenda to be ratified.
Thank you. And can we do these moving to a closed meeting? We can do the same way?
The moving to a close we can do, it's because it's an open meeting. So all we need is a resolution.
It is.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, thank you. So are we in that close then?